It's not often that we get Linux distros created by major tech companies that are released to the public, but Clear Linux is one such thing. Backed by Intel, Clear Linux is still an open source project, but one aimed at developers, researchers, engineers, and other groups with a focus on security and powerful performance. Here we review Clear Linux, telling you whether this powerful Linux distro is the right one for you. Most users are familiar with what are often called mainstream distros: Ubuntu, Fedora, Mint, CentOS, Arch, you name it. They're the distros that are most often targeted by guides, and they're the distros that are supported most widely. However, there are other distros that are excellent for specific purposes. A great example of this tailored distro is Clear Linux. Clear Linux is a Linux distribution created by Intel, and it's tailored to developers, researchers, and anyone who's using Linux as a tool rather than a desktop. Here we take a look at Clear Linux, the McLaren of Linux distros, and see who it is and isn't for. Installing Clear Linux. If I had to guess, there's not much about the Clear Linux installer that you've experienced before. It's honestly refreshing, as I've spent so much time with the Anaconda installer that the user-friendliness of this installer is a shock. It still has many options like the Anaconda installer, but performs better and looks much nicer. I particularly like the way that you can disable telemetry from the installer, which makes you feel that you are fully in control of your distro rather than Intel. You can also disable automatic updates from the installer. And you can install a bunch of additional software packages for scientific, mathematical, or other work purposes. The installation process is almost seamless, and I greatly appreciate the simplicity of it. It makes the idea of imaging, wiping, re-imaging, or reinstalling on a workstation seem much less daunting. Clear Linux first impressions. Many things about Clear Linux seem superfluous and necessary, but there's much more here than meets the eye. First of all, it's not vanilla GNOME shell. GNOME normally tries to hide much of the workstation administration features behind a curtain, but Clear Linux makes some focused changes to GNOME shell that make it seem much more catered. They put the terminal app in the favorites, for example, and they put the default apps into folders in the app drawer. The resource image is much better than standard GNOME shell on Fedora, which is as close to upstream GNOME as it gets. RAM usage hovers around 1 GB on a fresh boot, whereas Clear Linux sits around 500 MB. Plus there are some other little usability tweaks made, like adding minimize and maximize buttons, a couple of mail apps pre-installed, and a nice modern app theme that doesn't get in the way. Software availability. One of the main concerns I had when first experimenting with Clear Linux a little while ago was the lack of available software. It felt way more specialised than I wanted, and I felt limited. However, Flatpaks are available for Clear Linux, and that adds a whole separate avenue through which you can get software. You can get things like GIMP, Audacity, Microsoft Teams, GNOME Boxes, Slack, Zoom, and LibreOffice on Clear Linux through Flatpaks, which makes for a relatively convincing professional workstation. If you just want a machine that works and ekes out the most performance from your Intel CPUs, there's no other choice than Clear Linux. You may have some kind of distro loyalty like many others in the community, but it's important to keep in mind that work needs to be done, and Clear Linux is an excellent way to do that. Who should use Clear Linux? Anyone looking to get absolute efficiency out of their Intel-based systems should use Clear Linux. It's a distro aimed at workstations and their power users with no frills and no distractions. If you enjoyed this Linux distro review, make sure to check out some of our other distro reviews on Endeavour OS, Gallium OS and Deepin Linux. Links in the description. Okay, as always, thank you so much for watching. That's all for now. See you next time.